Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good day, started your good day. Welcome to the fourth FISO International Conference on Global Anthropocene. For the safety of participants, as well as to enable our fellow scholars from all around the world to participate during this key event, we have initiated our very first free virtual international conference this year in 2021. So given that, if you wish to post updates on the conference proceedings, we invite everyone to use the hashtag FISO 2021. That is a hashtag FISO 2021. So feel free to post on your social media and invite everyone to the discourse right here. Now, before we start these events, may I show everyone the house rules that we will follow to ensure cohesion and clarity throughout our sessions. Okay, so to remind everyone, first off, please use appropriate equipment for the webinar. When using a mobile phone, use a headset to reduce the noise that they pick up in your location. So that also means to say that you should look for a place with less noise. Put your phone on silent mode. Avoid talking while the webinar is ongoing. Keep your microphones on mute at all times. We will turn them on for you, especially during the open forum. Be courteous and do not engage in a chat with others while the webinar is ongoing. So please pay attention to our speaker for these proceedings. You may participate actively and ask your questions during the open forum. So we have our chat here available for this discussion. Okay, and by the way, for those who may have noticed, we do have a sort of technical difficulty here where, if I'm not mistaken, some of you have seen your emails popped up as watermarks. So we apologize for that, and we are going to resolve that as soon as possible. So without any further ado, to formally welcome us to this momentous occasion, may we call the chair or the head of the FISO 2021 organizing cluster, Mr. Kebart Likayan. So let us give him a virtual round of applause.
Keynote speaker, Dr. Dahlia Simangan. To our keynote speaker, Dr. Dahlia Simangan, to our conference presenters, attendees, to the Philippine International Studies Organization community, friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the FISO 2021 Free Virtual International Conference. We are now in the second year of the pandemic. However, while vaccines and other therapeutic procedures are now available to treat COVID-19, mobility restrictions are still in place, thus providing challenges for scholars around the world to meet in person and engage in fruitful discussions. Cognizant of this reality as well as the hardships experienced by the Global South academics during this pandemic, the Philippine International Studies Organization decided to hold a free virtual international conference with the theme Global Anthropocene. Given the several challenges to pull off this conference, such as the availability of funding and necessary cyber infrastructure, the hindrances posed by the pandemic did not constrain the organizing committee to execute a conference attended by several experts, pioneering scholars, and practitioners coming from various parts of the world. In light of the current pandemic and the recent IPCC report about the irreversible consequences of global warming and climate change, this year's conference aims to revisit our already established idea of man's relationship to the natural world. Through a re-examination of our established knowledge systems, schemas, and orientations, this year's conference highlights various contributions about cases and experiences that affirms the necessity of rethinking our anthropocentric view of approaching various global issues. To all participants of the 2021 FISO International Conference, we wish to express our heartfelt gratitude for your continued interest and support of our scholarly endeavor. On behalf of the organizing team, thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
That was
To our keynote speaker, Dr.
Mr. Likayan, everyone. So send us this recording, but nevertheless, he is here with us to witness this occasion. So this morning, we will begin day one of this conference, and we begin that with our keynote speaker, who will be delivering her talk on disrupting the universality of the Anthropocene. So our keynote speaker for today is Dr. Dahlia Simangan. She is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Hiroshima University, where she teaches global governance and peace-building cases. She's also one of the core members of the Hiroshima University Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, or NERPS. She is a former JSPS postdoctoral research fellow at the United Nations University in Tokyo and holds a PhD in International Relations from the Australian National University, an MA in International Relations from the International University of Japan, and a BA in Sociology from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dahlia's research interests include post-conflict peace building, the peace sustainability nexus, and international relations in the Anthropocene. She is the author of International Peace Building and Local Involvement, a Liberal Renaissance, and has published in International Affairs, Third World Quarterly, Ambio, and the Anthropocene Review, among other journals. Her research has been recognized by the International Studies Association Women's Caucus, Australian Political Studies Association Environmental Politics and Policy Standing Research Group, and the Academic Council on the United Nations System. She currently serves as the assistant editor of the Peace Building Journal and a member of the board of directors of the Global Peace Building Association of Japan. Dahlia is the co-founder of Peace Perspectives, a Nepal-based research and outreach organization, and creator of the Scholars Unbound podcast or video series. So allow me to read the abstract for her talk on disrupting the universality of the Anthropocene. The universalizing tendency of the Anthropocene as a concept overshadows the injustices and inequalities in human society. Those most responsible for the causes of the Anthropocene are less likely to bear the brunt of its consequences, while those who are least responsible are generally the most vulnerable. Unsustainable practices and even responses to environmental challenges in the Anthropocene may amplify present injustices and inequalities between and within societies. The challenge for IR scholars, practitioners, and students is to disrupt these Western-centric, hubristic, and exclusionary tendencies and situate the myriad histories, vulnerabilities, and agencies in this new geological epoch. This keynote speech offers an overview and some considerations for pluralizing IR disciplines engagement with the Anthropocene discourse. So without much further ado, may we welcome on stage Dr. Dahlia. A round of applause for her.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marlouis, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the FISO organizers. Special thanks to Kev Likayan for reaching out to me early this year. That was really exciting when I read his message. And I also want to thank the FISO president, Professor Francis Antoinette Cruz. I'm truly, truly humbled by this opportunity to speak about the Anthropocene. And what a pity, we can get together physically. I would have had my taho for breakfast, maybe Jollibee for later. But yeah, I miss those. But I'm really grateful for FISO for providing us this platform. I understand the hard work behind online events, so massive congratulations to the organizers. At first, I felt lonely as a Filipino with a background in IR and interested in the Anthropocene. I felt like I had no one to talk to about it, especially when I realized at first that the conversations are not being driven by researchers, activists, and practitioners from our region. But I was wrong. I just didn't look hard enough, I think, to know that the conversations like this conference about the Anthropocene are now being collectively shaped by us from this part of the anthropos that was neither acknowledged nor included, but it exists and it remains ever present. When I chanced upon this term, a couple of years ago, I was intrigued because I first read it from the work of David Chandler, whose publications on international peacebuilding influenced my own research on post-conflict peacebuilding. I was intrigued by the way peace scholars are engaging with the concept and the implications of this concept for the conditions of peace and conflict. And I also started exploring what IR scholars are saying about the Anthropocene and how IR scholarship is engaging with this concept and with this reality. I must say at this point that obviously I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a geologist or sustainability scientist. I was trained in sociology and IR, and my work mainly touches on, as Mar-Louis said, on topics within peace and conflict studies. But peace and conflict and international relations are also influenced by global environmental change, by the Anthropocene, and how we make sense of it. But most importantly, as an Earthling, I want to make sense of our changing Earth system. What I'd like to share with you this morning that will hopefully encourage difficult but important questions during the sessions today and tomorrow is first this problematic conceptualization of the Anthropocene as an all-encompassing or universalizing concept. And second, how our discipline is engaging with the discourse surrounding the Anthropocene. And finally, how we as students, scholars, and practitioners from this region, from the Global South, as members of the Anthropos, can disrupt the universalizing tendencies that are underpinning this concept. What I will be sharing today is a rough synthesis of what I have written and contemplated about in the last couple of years. And to guide us in exploring the answers to these questions, let's first briefly answer the what, the when, the why, and the who of the Anthropocene. So what is the Anthropocene? It was a term coined by biologist Eugene Stormer, and actually Eugene Stormer coined this in the 1980s, but it was popularized in his 2000 commentary co-written by Nobel laureate and chemist Paul Crutzen. And it goes without saying that the Anthropocene is the proposed geological epoch, signifying that humanity collectively is the main driving force behind the changing Earth system. The term is yet to be officially adopted, but what's clear from those who use this term is that the stratigraphic signature of the impact of human activities on the biosphere is so distinct from that of the current Holocene epoch, that it's so distinct that it demands a new term. So what the term suggests is that our actions are not just transcending geographical boundaries. These actions are now planetary in scale. So when did the Anthropocene start? There are several proposals to this, and I just want us to look at some of the most cited dates. The earliest one is the discovery of fire. According to Andrew Glickson, the early Anthropocene around 1.8 million years ago, that's when the early Anthropocene started. And it happened because our species learned how to ignite fire. And this mastery of fire is something so unique to our species. And this mastery is manifested in our ability to burn other living beings. Now we're burning fossil fuels and therefore change the climate. So for this reason, Stephen Pine actually calls this new epoch as the Pyrocene. That's an alternative name to it. A later date is around 8,000, 6,000 years ago when our species discovered agriculture and then later produced technologies for advancing our agricultural practices. And this is William Rudimann's proposal when he showed anomalous gas trends that coincided with the forest clearance and later rice irrigation. And some scientists actually corroborate this proposal by looking at species extinction, because the Anthropocene is not just manifested by climate change, as we know, but also by biodiversity loss, among other forms of environmental degradation. And scientists found out that our dependence on agricultural activities also hindered the migration of other species, which then can change evolutionary patterns. And a much more recent date is the European colonization of the Americas. So in 1492, Columbus arrived in the Americas, but it was only in 1610, a little over 100 years later, when the impact of European colonization was felt back in the atmosphere or in the biosphere. And this resulted in two phenomena unprecedented in Earth's history. First is the human-driven exchange of species between continents. And second, this orbit spike or the dramatic dip in CO2 levels. According to Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, this spike happened when 50 million people, mostly farmers, died of smallpox that was brought by the colonizers, leaving their farms untended, when the trees flourished and again sucked back CO2 from the atmosphere. So these earlier dates actually are actually alternatives to the widely proposed starting date of the Anthropocene, which is the Industrial Revolution. After all, Crutzen and Stormer assigned 1784, the year when the steam engine was invented, as the starting date of the Anthropocene. And they said it was during this time when the atmospheric concentrations of CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases started growing rapidly. And the most recent date is around in the middle of the 20th century, when it was not just the level of greenhouse gas emissions that is accelerating, but also ocean acidification, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. And this is what Will Steffen and his colleagues call the Great Acceleration. And they noted that it was in the 1950s when human population exploded, tied to the globalization of economies and information, that when the Anthropocene started. Something that is historical and geological in this case that happened around this period was the earlier in 1945, at the height of the Second World War. At 5:29 in the morning of July 16, 1945, the first nuclear test, codenamed Trinity, was conducted in the desert of New Mexico in the US. Less than a month later, on August 6, 1945, the US bombed Hiroshima and then Nagasaki 3 days after, using the results from that test. So the photo you see here is what remains of the Industrial Promotion Hall of Hiroshima Prefecture, which is now preserved as the Atomic Bomb Dome. And nuclear weapons testing since then generated immediate and long-term harmful effects on human health and the global environment. Although the 1994 adoption of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty by the UN ceased all types of nuclear tests, the destructive legacy of nuclear weapons continues to this day and will likely continue or last for the next hundreds of years. So for this reason, and in parallel with the Great Acceleration, some scientists are convinced that the first nuclear test marks the advent of the Anthropocene. Assigning a date or a period as to when the Anthropocene started is not just a matter of finding the most convincing geological evidence, it's also a matter of political consequences. As Lewis and Maslin reminded us, the chosen date matters because it will be used to shape the political responses to living in the Anthropocene. For example, a very early date could be used to normalize and downplay today's global environmental change, while dating it to the Industrial Revolution might be used to assign historical responsibility for the impacts of today's environmental problems. But whether the Anthropocene started as early as our mastery of fire or as recent as the Great Acceleration, the different forms of global environmental change that we are experiencing now can be traced back to those markers and other markers in between. The activities behind these markers have a cumulative effect on our Earth system. So looking at this proposed starting dates of the Anthropocene, we can also sketch the answer as to why the Anthropocene started, or how did we get here in the first place? Is it because of our mastery of fire, our mastery of agriculture, because of European colonization, European industrialization, or economic globalization? Although atmospheric and stratigraphic levels and other archaeological, cultural, historical, and geological explanations help pinpoint when the Anthropocene started, the common thread that links these markers is that human activities are now the major geological force, that the Earth system entered a new geological age because of us. But who do we mean by us, by humanity, when we talk about the Anthropocene? Who is the Anthropos? The answer to this question is again informed by the question of how did we get here? If it was indeed because of the mastery of fire and agriculture, then the Anthropocene is caused by all of humanity in the past, at present, and in the future. But fire and agriculture have been mastered by different societies differently at different times. As an example of this differentiation, thanks to our mastery of fire and combustion, we were able to harness different sources of energy, including fossil fuels. So our energy consumption is a double-edged sword because it enabled efficient manufacturing and prompted urbanization, but it also increased carbon emissions and accelerated environmental degradation. And who are doing these emissions? On a country level, we can see that the Western Europe, the seat of the Industrial Revolution, was the primary emitter of CO2. But only from the period of post-World War II reconstruction did the other regions start recording significant emissions. But most geographically relevant to us is the Asia-Pacific region. And in this graph, we can see that in 2017, the region contributed 48% of global CO2 emissions, 27% from China, 6% from India, and 14% from the rest of the region. When we look at these statistics, let's not forget that the Asia-Pacific region is home to around 60% of the global population. So in that case, we also need to look at the per capita CO2 emissions. And in this graph, you can see that China and India trail behind most of the major industrialized economies. And it's also important to note here that a part of their overall emissions can be attributed to carbon leakage, or the outsourcing of carbon and energy-intensive production and industries to developing countries. Despite policies to cut national or regional emissions, global trade still enables the shifting of emissions from developed to emerging economies, in which carbon-intensive goods produced by developing or emerging economies are exported to consumers in the countries with advanced economies. And most of the population growth also since 1950 has been in the non-OECD world, but the world's economy based on GDP and therefore based on consumption is still strongly dominated by the OECD world. And if we look at historical emissions, the contribution from our region very minuscule compared to the industrialized part of the world that emitted most of this greenhouse gases and CO2 in particular. And you probably know where I'm going here, and that is to argue that the Anthropocene is not caused by all of humanity, but only by those who is the most responsible for historical emissions. And some would say that we also need to consider the most recent or current emissions because solutions to the challenges in the Anthropocene can only be situated in more recent history now and in the future. I completely agree with this, but we also have to consider the agents and the recipients of those solutions. In other words, in addition to temporality and spatiality as to when and where of the Anthropocene, we also need to situate the agency in the Anthropocene, circling back again to that question of who. Historical emissions are also linked with past activities that involve the colonization of people who are also the most vulnerable to environmental issues at present. Europeans colonized much of the Asia-Pacific region, and even territories that were not official European protectorates in the region or not official colonies, they still experience different forms of subjugation. And according to Lightfoot, surplus production from resource exploitation of colonies drove colonial enterprises, transforming global ecosystems even before the Industrial Revolution. So on this account, the structures of colonialism and the global patterns of overconsumption enabled the advent of the Anthropocene. And these structures were created, maintained, and exported by European colonizers. The very record of historical CO2 emissions indicates a Eurocentric Anthropocene. And for this reason, Jairus Grove proposed an alternative term, the Eurocene. And also to better capture the environmental cost of the commodification of nature for the purpose of capital accumulation, Jason Moore proposed the term capitalocene. So these are just two of the now around 100, I think, proposed alternative terms to the term Anthropocene. And we are not entirely wrong if we say that there will be probably more. And as Stephanie Fischel and her co-authors aptly put it, the Anthropocene demands multiple names because it is manifested and experienced in a multitude of ways. And these alternatives, in one way or another, reject the universality of the Anthropocene, pluralize the narratives about it, and also bring to the fore the fact that the Anthropocene is white, colonialist, and capitalist. But among all these alternatives, I'm quite inclined to favor Donna Haraway's Catholicene because it acknowledges a myriad of stories in this epoch, and these stories can converge and diverge. And as in her words, Catholicene is a name for an elsewhere and elsewhen that was, still is, and might yet be. I recognize that a universal term such as the Anthropocene fails to reflect the inequalities and hierarchies of collective human history. That's why Anna Greer calls for a deconstruction of the term. I also recognize Baskin's warning that the Anthropocene can be an ideological tool to universalize or normalize a certain portion of humanity as the human of the Anthropocene. But while acknowledging that the rationales behind these alternatives are valid, I will continue using the term Anthropocene because of its geological roots and despite its conceptual flaws and universalizing tendencies. I also consider that the very problematic connotation of the term incited the much needed engagement with the concept and the much needed deliberations within social sciences, especially, including the IR discipline. So how does our discipline's engagement with the Anthropocene look like? With the works of Simon Dalby, Audra Mitchell, Cameron Harrington, Christina Inoue, Anthony Burke, Stephanie Fischel, among others, for example, I understood that there is a small but growing debate within IR. But I was more curious about the components of this debate. So with what concepts are being emphasized and who is shaping the debates or conversations? And where do these conversations come from? So I did a bibliometric review of IR and IR-related articles that deal with the Anthropocene and published from 2000 until May 2019. So the discussion of this review was published in 2020, but for today, I just want to share some of the visualizations from that analysis. So it's also important to note here that the review is not exhaustive because I didn't include gray literature, and I also relied on the indexing of Web of Science. But I still believe that somehow it is representative of the dominant discourse surrounding the Anthropocene within our discipline. And here I want to show that out of 2,944 publications in English and with the word Anthropocene, only 134 are related to IR, and only 36 are listed under the IR category. I also contrasted our discipline with that of other disciplines. And it would really be interesting to see how the other disciplines are engaging with the Anthropocene. And that's why I really look forward to this afternoon's panel on revisiting the disciplines through the Anthropocene, chaired by Mr. Eric Kalata. But in this table, we see that environmental science and environmental studies top the list. which is not surprising, of course, given the focus on environmental issues when we talk about the Anthropocene, followed by geography. And here you will see where our broader discipline stands. This distribution shows us that that IR is not as engaged compared to the other disciplines. And I believe the reason for this, as scholars in our field have raised before, is the humanist foundations of our theoretical frameworks. In other words, our discipline is anthropocentric. And our discipline is also a little bit late to the party. Based on this review, only in 2011, a little over a decade after the term was popularized in 2000, did we start reading the term in IR publications. But that engagement is growing since then, if we look at the numbers of publications every year. So in 2015, the number of publications increased fourfold from 2014. And with growing engagement from our region, as exemplified by this conference, we can expect more publications in the coming years. But who does the speaking in the Anthropocene? And this is one of the questions raised by the conference organizers, reflecting the question by Eva Lovebrand and her colleagues, who speaks for the future of the Earth, and also the title of the edited book by Robert Emmett and Thomas Leaken, Who's Anthropocene? But for this review, I identified the affiliations of the authors, journals, and location of publication of the IR-related articles. And this figure shows the journal titles with more than 5 published articles on the Anthropocene and their article count. The host institutions of these journals and the affiliated institutions of their editors are mainly in the US, UK, Canada, Spain, France, and the Netherlands. And this map shows the geographical distribution of the IR-related articles on the Anthropocene using the countries of the author's affiliations. This distribution is again not surprising if we consider the general trend, right, in academic publishing. We know already that there's an imbalance between the global north and the global south when it comes to language requirements, when it comes to research funding availability, and even collaborative opportunities when it comes to academic publication processes. And that imbalance is also reflected here, the underrepresentation of global South perspectives in the broader Anthropocene discourse. But for a discipline that has for long criticized structural inequalities, I think we could do so much more in representing the marginal voices in the Anthropocene. I also visualized IR's engagement with the Anthropocene using a network map of keywords. Of the 176 keywords from the 36 articles, only 25 keywords have at least 2 co-occurrences. That is the number of documents the keywords appear together. And this network map consists of this, or visualizes these keywords. The closer the keywords are, the more they are related. The larger the circle is, the more frequent the keyword is used, and the thickness of the lines indicates the frequency of the keywords used in the same document. And to make sense of this map, beyond co-occurrences and frequencies, I clustered the terms according to their conceptual commonalities. These clusters are then labeled based on red for IR subjects, blue for environmental studies subject, yellow for conceptual broadening, and green for philosophical critique. So the prominence of keywords such as security, politics, conflict, geopolitics, law, and governance in the red cluster, the dominance of those suggests the dominance of conventional IR subjects. So the continued dominance of the subjects, despite locating them in the context of the Anthropocene, and the persistence of statist and economic development priorities imply the discipline's firm footing in its anthropocentric and modernist foundations. Meanwhile, keywords that are more associated with environmental studies, such as resilience, climate, biodiversity, and ecology, can also now be found in IR scholarship. This is again not surprising given the scope of this review, but what's worth noting here is that traditionally non-conventional IR subjects are now being articulated in relation to the global environment, which then suggests how the Anthropocene has become a tool for conceptual broadening in IR. And for this conference, for example, Dr. Romel Banlawi will talk about terrorism in the Anthropocene, and Dr. Patrick Bugarin will chair a panel about security in the Anthropocene, and with presentations that will situate our different and broadened articulations of security in this new geological age. So this is a demonstration of our discipline's ability and willingness to broaden its subjects of analysis from states and politics to environment, ecology, and the planet. The Anthropocene serves as a new backdrop for conventional IR issues, giving them a sense of urgency. And you will also notice how the terms Earth system governance and future in the yellow cluster are linked to conventional IR term of politics, security, and global governance. So this links for me signals IR's broader ontologies of time and space. Another prominent theme in the articles I reviewed is the critique towards human nature dualism. The Anthropocene was born out of this modernist understanding of dividing society and the non-human nature. And as Bruno Latour wrote, human beings have been deanimating the earth and distancing it from human experiences, although the earth is as animate as human beings. And in Chakrabarty's second thesis, he wrote, the idea of the Anthropocene severely qualifies humanist histories of modernity and globalization. So this modernist view separates us from nature, and this is a Western notion, according to the scholar. If we zoom into the indigenous ontologies of nature, non-human objects are animate. They are not objects, but rather subjects with agency and equal, and if not above us. Indeed, the indigenous ways of life found in animist traditions in many parts of the world espouse this human, non-human coexistence, and that is a nature comprising of and shared by all beings. For example, in a study by Howell, the Chewang people of the Malaysian rainforest treat all beings and things with ruwai, or as conscious people with rationality, with intentions and emotions. And many of the indigenous livelihood practices are inherently sustainable, but they were disrupted by the introduction of modern practices and infrastructure. For example, Lenny Camacho and her colleagues found out that the Muyong practices in the Cordillera Mountains of the Philippines promote sustainable forest management and biodiversity protection. As written in Fikret Berkey's book, Sacred Ecology, these local and indigenous practices are geared towards adaptive management, or the practice of acknowledging and managing the unknown, uncertain, and unexpected, a resource management skill essential in the age of the Anthropocene. But I think we also need to be reminded that sourcing from indigenous knowledge and practices could run the risk of objectifying and instrumentalizing indigenous agency. Rubies and Thoreau reminded us of that sometimes when scholars and practitioners do their research or advocacy work, such work could expose indigenous communities to intervention, which then could lead to unintentional ecological disruption, such as dispossession, deforestation, and landscape transformation. But there are many examples of these indigenous worldviews and practices that we can all draw from when we disrupt the universalizing solutions to the challenges in the Anthropocene. That's why I'm really also excited for this afternoon's panel on analysis of indigenous India's post-colonial Anthropocene, chaired by Ms. Lorna Israel, and tomorrow's panel on religion, environment, and the Anthropocene, chaired by Haji Saje, as well as the panel on indigenous knowledge and belief system, chaired by John Harvey Gamas. For example, the concept of buen vivir that Eduardo Acosta will present tomorrow is rooted in the indigenous concept of harmonious coexistence, in which a conceptual divide doesn't exist between human and nature. So in the Anthropocene, our anthropogenic impact on the rest of the physical world, our entanglement with non-human nature erases this divide. And this reaffirms another of Chakrabarty's theses, that the anthropogenic explanations of climate change spell the collapse of the age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history. But allow me to encourage all of us today not to stop at recognizing this problematic human nature dualism, but to disrupt such narratives with other ways of knowing about our place in nature, the knowledge and ways that have always been there anyway. And it was enlightening to me when I read Christina Inoue article about the Yanomami practices in Brazil. They listen to voices from stories, poems, myths, dreams, and songs. But this listening is often dismissed by Western epistemology, according to Inoue. But these practices allow the Yanomami of Brazil to coexist with the non-human world. So the alternative terms that I mentioned earlier are ways of disrupting this universalizing tendencies of the Anthropocene, specifically as Eurocentrism or Western-centrism. As IR students and scholars, we can contribute to this disruption and pluralize our conversations by reminding our colleagues of the outcomes of historical inequalities and injustices and their consequences on our differentiated responsibilities, vulnerabilities, and capabilities. And speaking of this, I cannot miss tomorrow's panel on Anthroposensibilities, chaired by Attorney Capistrano, and the panel on the economic and social cost of living in the age of the Anthropocene, chaired by Dr. Melanie Reyes. The legacy of inequalities, such as those rooted in racism, colonialism, and marginalization, influences our experiences of environmental crises. And the roots of this crisis are magnified in the Anthropocene, and they will impede global action unless they are addressed. Many of us, including myself, are likely to nod in affirmation with what Rohan de Souza observed, that in general, while developed countries call for collective action, many of the countries in the global south remain hesitant to cooperate in solutions that do not account their experiences of historical injustice and inequality. I think there's a dissonance here between problems and solutions. That's why it's important to deal with environmental crises and advocate for environmental justice by drawing on these histories, dark as they are, because they contain specific aspirations from specific places with people who may be vulnerable to global environmental change, but still with a story and with agency. Of course, we cannot deny the observation that some post-colonial countries are also responsible for many environmentally harmful practices. Indonesia, for example, according to Global Forest Watch in 2019, records one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. So deforestation destroys and degrades natural habitats, leading to biodiversity loss, which is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the manifestations of the Anthropocene. According to IPCC in 2014, deforestation is the second largest source of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions after fossil fuel combustion. Countries that are allowing this alarming deforestation rates have been vilified in climate talks. But it's also important to be reminded that while slowing down the deforestation rate is an important factor, of course, to climate change mitigation, focusing on reducing fossil fuel combustion should still be the top priority if we really want to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And we also need to examine more closely the supply chain of deforestation. In the case of Indonesia, its agricultural and forestry exports, including the palm oil exports, are responsible for 23% of the country's deforestation. And these exports mainly go to high-income and middle-income countries. And for many of these advanced economies, their imports from deforestation emissions are actually greater than their emissions from their domestic agricultural production. But for Indonesians, the forests are not just exports. They are essential, especially among small-scale subsistence farmers. And that's why Astuti and MacGregor remind us what's behind these talks about green economy and indigenous welfare. And this is one of these hubristic tendencies coming out from universalizing solutions. So when we look at these forms of production vis-a-vis the global supply chain and demand, these initiatives that are sometimes externally imposed may continue to exclude indigenous communities. And it's not only the white colonialist, consumerist foreigners who impose these standards who are to be blamed here. We know very well that poor governance undermines these environmental policies, no matter how well-meaning and excellent they are on paper. And several studies have shown how corrupt political and business elites hijack the support and assistance to climate-affected communities and capture the revenues from such initiatives instead of distributing them to the communities. From Thailand to Vanuatu, elite capture of funding for climate change adaptation undermines the gains of community-based initiatives. The panel on policy governance chaired by Francis Esteban will surely illuminate us on some of these issues. And on an international level, tense geopolitics, especially in our region, also poses serious issues. Rising sea levels, of course, and natural disasters due to climate change are already forcing millions of people out of their homes and destroying their livelihoods. According to the Environmental Justice Foundation in 2018, Bangladesh is predicted to lose 11% of its land to a 50-centimeter sea level rise, displacing an estimated 15 million people. Meanwhile, India continues the construction of border fences in anticipation of higher influxes of climate migrants. The warming climate is also melting Himalayan glaciers faster than they can be replenished, increasing flood risks and decreasing the freshwater supply in Nepal, which we know is already facing many socioeconomic issues. Meanwhile, the rivalry between Beijing and Delhi creates so much uncertainty over the future of water security for a landlocked country like Nepal. All these issues also challenge the state-centric, militaristic, and capitalist-driven model of the world. The realities of the Anthropocene challenge the foundations of the current international order, duly preserved by state-centric priorities, militarized forms of security, and consumption-driven economy. These foundations appear incompatible with the measures required to overcome environmental challenges that are global in nature and beyond the limits of these of our anthropocentric sense of agency, temporality, and spatiality. And these foundations are also considered to be the foundations of our discipline, and even more worryingly, the foundations of global governance. For example, the entities of the international system, such as the UN and other international organizations, are the safeguards of this state-centric system, as well as the champions of economic growth-driven development. So because of these shortcomings, several scholars have presented alternatives to IR's traditional thoughts and processes to enable it to remain relevant and also to contribute to addressing the challenges in the Anthropocene. For example, in the article on Planet Politics by Anthony Burke and his co-authors, they recommend that IR return to its interdisciplinary roots. And in the post-humanist IR perspective, Erica Cudworth and Stephen Hobden call for a move away from this anthropocentric intellectualism in IR and include non-human subjects and dynamics. This is also mirrored in Audra Mitchell's suggestion of adopting a cosmopolitical view of global ethics that highlights the problem of human-centered approaches and considers the security of all life on Earth. The current international order finds itself unable to confront the profound issues and complex issues beyond the nation-state system. And the persistence of national interests that feeds the system is incapable of addressing issues arising from anthropogenic factors. Again, as in Chakrabarty's fourth thesis, the cross-hatching of species history and the history of capital is a process of probing the limits of historical understanding. The Anthropocene and how we are dealing with its manifestations are already exposing our limited understanding of geological history vis-a-vis human history. So IR theories in the Anthropocene need to include both the problem-solving and critical purposes theory. The parallel sessions this afternoon on sustainable development chaired by Denson Akomula, and on critical perspectives on justice and political change in times of uncertainty chaired by Arnaud Kurtze are relevant to this. And it's imperative to combine practical policy efforts to curb the threats in the Anthropocene with questioning, or even maybe radically transforming the political and economic frameworks that gave rise to this epoch. Ideally, this will develop new political and economic configurations that will modify conventional conceptualizations of sovereignty, autonomy, and citizenship. In particular, the planetary scale of environmental threats demands a reconfiguration of the international system. This doesn't mean that the current model of individual nation states independently protecting their citizens should be abandoned altogether. Instead, protecting those who are usually considered outsiders should be given equal importance to improving relations among insiders. And worth highlighting here is the phenomenon of migration, especially when we talk about outsiders and insiders, right? Migration is consistently being presented as an issue that needs to be securitized. Yes, it must be securitized if we consider it as an aberration or a problem that needs to be solved. During one of our discussions here at the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability at Hiroshima University, one of the reflections that came about when we were thinking about the relationship between peace and sustainability is that migration is not an aberration that needs solving. Contrary to what is often implied in contemporary political debates and in the media too, migration is an ordinary component of social life throughout human history. Of course, there are tensions, conflicts, suffering, and diverging views that surround mobility. But to manage, instead of securitizing migration, which is an ordinary product of extraordinary transformation, is to depathologize and demystify migration. And in doing so, it's important to reconceptualize migration and other issues that are dubbed as security issues when we study them. Samid Suleiman, for example, presents some alternative traditions and cultures of mobility that depart from more territorial conceptualization or Westphalian conception of migration, because this conception is currently understood as a disruption of the international system. If it is, then why don't we also disrupt this so-called disruption? And in contrast to the territorial thought, according to Suleiman about migration, the island communities possess a dynamic and fluid understanding of mobility that is promoted rather than hindered by the ocean. And that's why the small island states of the Pacific and Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean are now identifying themselves as large ocean states to move beyond their territorial landmass and highlight the marine biodiversity of the oceans. In his 2016 address to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, Tommy Remengesau Jr., the former president of Palau, declared that his country is not a small island state, but a large ocean state. Palau may only have 459 square kilometers of land area, but it has a national marine sanctuary in its 600,000 square kilometer of exclusive economic zone. And that is actually the size of California. So this reconceptualization of these dominant narratives is important in rethinking our place and our agency in the Anthropocene. We can start with the islands. The Philippines is an archipelago. Japan is an archipelago. Our islands are not separated from each other. They are connected by our seas and our oceans. As Jonathan Pugh and David Chandler argue in their book, Anthropocene Islands, which will be launched tomorrow afternoon, islands indeed embody relational entanglements. So identifying our place and agency in the Anthropocene is also a response to the differentiated vulnerabilities that we experience whenever there are floodings, droughts, and other extreme weather conditions that immediately and directly impact our lives. And differentiated vulnerabilities have now become more familiar because of the pandemic. Of course, the virus doesn't discriminate, but the probability of being infected by it and how we experience its impact do discriminate. At the height of the COVID-19 lockdowns, we have seen the contrast between celebrities self-isolating in their mansions and street vendors in the Philippines for walking 4 miles just to buy food. And we also see the difference in government responses from militarized lockdowns to physical distancing rules, border closures, state of emergency. All these responses have different effect on people. And the effect depends on their job, their residence where they live, and their wealth. And to be vulnerable to environmental change is not a stranger to being a Filipino. And it's also not a stranger to many of our neighbors in the region. According to the Global Climate Risk Index for 2018, the Philippines is the second most at risk to climate change, second to Japan. And in their most recent index of 2019, the Philippines drops off the list. But if we extend this time frame back to all the way to 1999, the Philippines remains to be one of the 10 countries most at risk, with many of them actually being islands from the Asian region. And this brings us back to the importance of framing the Anthropocene around the islands. As a matter of sheer geographic coincidence, the Philippines is accustomed to tropical cyclones or typhoons, with an average of 20 typhoons hitting the country annually. And in recent years, the intensity of these typhoons has increased, primarily because of warming oceans. And the 3 strongest typhoons in recorded history actually occurred within the past decade, and all of them made landfall in the Philippines. And our country actually has 16.7% of the population living in poverty. So just imagine the impact of that. And it's easy to dismiss the vulnerable as incapable when we hear the news about all this incidents and just, end there. Vulnerable, they are vulnerable, just end at vulnerability. But I think we also need to be reminded that vulnerability was caused mainly by external oppression more than internal failings. But to be vulnerable doesn't mean that there's no agency, right? Societies vulnerable to these global environmental risks have shown creativity in drawing on their ontologies and epistemologies, as I mentioned earlier, and they do that to survive, to fight back, and to exercise their agency. And let me quote here the late Coretti Mavayega Tiumalu, the organizer of 350 Pacific. It's a youth-led network of climate activists from the Pacific Islands. And the quote is, "We come from a people who have lived sustainably and in harmony with nature and with our environment for centuries. So to be labeled as passive victims or to have some of our islands be seen as the possible first climate refugees is really not well received in the Pacific. Our key message is we're not drowning, we're fighting." And I strongly believe that this is the agency that needs to shape the conversations about the Anthropocene. Policies and actions should still be implemented by carbon emitters, by wealthier countries. We also need to continue holding accountable corporations and politicians who profit from the destruction of our planet. But the design and goals of those policies must include the voices, the experiences, and the agency of the vulnerable. We don't need to dig deep into social media recently to read some of the disappointments about the COP26 in Glasgow. There are observations that the negotiations are somehow exclusionary of young voices and of global South perspectives. And this is where we can play an important role. There's a tendency for global action, which is often negotiated at this high-level diplomatic tables, and sometimes over several years, to be detached from everyday people. And according to John Dryzek and Jonathan Pickering, the global discourses that we hear from political gatherings such as COP are so disconnected from everyday experiences. And this disconnect could reinforce the universalizing accounts of vulnerability, which then could overshadow the agency of the vulnerable people. And for these reasons, it's important for global initiatives to be flexible and relevant to local or everyday contexts, so as not to compete with more urgent economic needs of the people. I think while we leave the effectiveness of environmental policies in the Anthropocene to the climate scientists, our discipline can contribute to ensuring that these policies are just and inclusive. The age of humanity is a reminder of the origins of human entanglement with nature, as well as human interconnectedness. The Anthropocene not only confirms human agency for changing the environment, it also exposes human vulnerability to environmental change. If we have the agency to be this geological force, then we also have the agency to mitigate the challenges in the Anthropocene. However, this anthropocentric view, again, favors human exceptionalism. For example, our so-called Save the Planet could potentially lead to further marginalization of the already poor and marginalized groups, especially in the global South. They could be solutions, yes, but as in the words of Frank Bierman and Ina Muller, they could be more like rich man's solutions or rich man's policies. For example, the use of climate engineering, if not inclusive of the options for developing countries, because developing countries often lack the capability to adapt to these technologies or manage the impact of these technologies, that will be very problematic. Of course, one could argue that eco-modernism is a welcome perspective on an otherwise apocalyptic version of the Anthropocene, because it shows the perspective of the good Anthropocene. But we need to question what entails the good here. What are the moral, ethical, political, and social implications of this same anthropocentrism? Interrogating that question, I believe, is a matter of interest for our discipline and other social sciences. We need to be careful of this assertion of human domination through eco-modernist and geoengineering solutions. We need to be careful also because they may reinforce the same separation of human and non-human nature, or worse, the domination of human over nature, the very reason why we are in the Anthropocene. And we need to be careful because they run the risk of employing and then universalizing quick, but morally, ethically, and socially unjust solutions. And we can deliver these messages through a more transdisciplinary conversation with physical sciences and across different sectors. So this need for transdisciplinarity is reaffirmed by key publications of international organizations. In 2020, the UNDP released its annual report and presented policy perspectives that situate human development within the complexities of the Anthropocene. Also, the language of the recent IPCC report is also less conservative as in the past in saying that humanity is causing climate change. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres echoes this message when he said that the report is a code red for humanity. We are at the fulcrum of collective human history, with one side leaning toward our survival and the other our demise. For my remaining time, I want to try to be somehow provocative. My good friend Google told me that that's what a good speaker does, so I will try. But even without Googling that, when the news from Myanmar broke out early this year, while we are at the grips of the pandemic, when the news of the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan broke out recently, while record-breaking temperatures are felt in many parts of the world, I'm struck but also not surprised by how humanity cannot grasp the temporality of life other than its own. We are facing a pandemic that kills and impoverishes mostly the vulnerable. We are facing a climate crisis that will eventually impact or wipe all of us under the business as usual practices. And yet, a group of men armed with weapons and religious fanaticism, obsessed with power, want to impose their rule. It is outrageous. While the rich white capitalist men confer in Glasgow, there is a climate change-induced famine sweeping the island of Madagascar, a country with 0.13 metric tons of CO2 emissions per capita in 2018. And to put that into perspective, an average US American emits about 1 metric ton in 2 weeks, almost 10 times as that of an average Malagasy emits in a year. It is outrageous. In tipping the fulcrum of our collective human history, we cannot let the rich white capitalist men do the tipping in their favor. We need the Malagasy, the Filipinos, the everyday people, the young people, the women, the poor, the marginalized. They are not disinterested. They were excluded, and they are not invisible. They were not seen. They are actually speaking, but they were silenced. For many of us, to disrupt these universal narratives and to channel our outrage, it's as simple as to participate, to show up, or to speak. And in the open forum, I really encourage you to not just ask questions, but also to speak about what provoked you to write about or talk about the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene may have not been caused by all of us, only by some of them, and yet we are living in this reality disproportionately. To disrupt these universals is to be present. Our very own existence is already a disruption to dominance and oppression, but it's also the creation of a new reality within the Anthropocene or beyond it. But this reality, from the microscopic to the planetary, is Gaia, alive and home to all living beings. The Anthropocene is plural, so let me also speak in Tagalog in the spirit of pluralizing the Anthropocene narratives, because this is not all about the anthropos or that one anthropos. At hindi lang ang sangkatauhan kung hindi ang buong sangtibutan at ang mga susunod pa. Maraming salamat. Thank you. I end my presentation here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dahlia. I hope you don't mind me giving my brief gasp of appreciation for how you precisely threaded every dot of this conference. I would say a conference could be compared to a book, and you were a thorough and engaging introduction to everything to come. So we also how you incorporated all the panels in your presentation. So it gave much coherence to not only to the themes and to what is established, but what is to come as well. So not only personally, but I believe everyone really appreciated what you have said. In fact, I could even say that you embodied your principle of pluralism in the discipline, to IR going into its interdisciplinary roots. This is definitely what we've been looking forward to. And because of that, I feel that keynote speeches should be like this, to glue every sub-theme to the main idea of the conference, so that it looks like the start of a powerful story, so that when we go home, we tell everyone about the conference. It definitely feels like it. So thank you for that. And so I believe everyone here is excited to deliver their questions, to ask their questions for the open forum. So may we call on Attorney Archil Nina Capistrano for the to moderate this open forum, and I hope that everyone can participate in this discourse.
Thank you very much, Marlui. And of course, a major round of applause to our keynote speaker, Dr. Dahlia Simangan. It's an outstanding presentation. Marlui has practically stated what I would want to state also, no? that you actually began with making us know the WH questions, the answers to the WH questions about the Anthropocene, and showed to us really that it's that problem of mastering the planet, which turned out to be a great premium on our anthropogenic agency, which turned out to be not only creative, but also destructive to the point of committing practically a planetary ecocide, and that there may be solutions, but problems to solutions mismatches are really very much visible, and that there are dismissive epistemologies, and you are actually invoking, or you're actually provoking all of us to think of ways of going not only to disrupt, but yes, what the colonial scholars would also say as, or call as, epistemic disobedience, how we can go about it as people from the global South. So for this part, I would like to encourage our audience. We have been very much cerebrally and intellectually stimulated with this very outstanding talk. Indeed, this raises the bar for all keynotes for FISO in the coming conferences. No? So thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to learn with you and to unlearn so many things. Okay, to those of us who are excited to interact with Dr. Dahlia here for your questions and even comments, please make sure to either type at the chat box or raise your hand. And then once you are recognized, please introduce yourself and your institutional affiliation. Okay, we have one particular hand raised. I would like to recognize Romel Kuraming. Romel, after that, Emmanuel Kaliwan. Okay, Romel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Archie. And thank you, Dr. Dahlia, for a brilliant keynote. I agree with the rest of the group that, yeah, we're really very rich and very thought-provoking, very well thought out. I really appreciate that. I also agree with your analysis, particularly about the need to disrupt or to fragment the universalized this kind of narratives about Anthropocene. I'm wondering that if this kind of disruption or fragmentation of the narrative Anthropocene will mainly be some kind of an intellectual analysis and solution to the issue, and insofar as the need to address the Anthropocenic condition, we might also, I'm just wondering if we might also have to resort to a universalized approach, given the geological, geological environmental nature of the problem. So we have this problem that, as you also noted, that the most powerful are the ones who created really this kind of problem. And this kind of disruption of the narrative Anthropocene that works very well in apportioning the blame, who to blame. And we can look at capitalism, European expansions, mainly the white people's contribution. On the other hand, if we look into the non-universalized approach to Anthropocene, as you mentioned about indigenous approach, post-humanism, so we come up with these opportunities to understand the voices of the marginalized and all. But the marginalized, by the very nature of their marginality, they really don't have much power to really come up with policies that will address this kind of problem. So I'm wondering, because I think both of these approach, the universalized and the fragmented, they both have problems. It's just a question of, insofar as addressing the Anthropocene, which of these two approaches would be more effective in really addressing this kind of problem? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Attorney Capistrano, should I answer that now or okay? Yeah, thank you, Romel, for the excellent question. And I also agree with you, grappling with this, either it should be a universal or non-universal. Are we going to have a global solutions? Because in nature, essentially global solutions are quite all-encompassing and universalist, or we have to really fragment, and what would be the implications of such fragmentation if we talk about practical policy making. I think my first comment on this is that I think we have to be comfortable with uncertainty, and this is exactly what the Anthropocene maybe wants us to really feel, that we are now in this epoch that is so uncertain, and we have to be comfortable with this. And even in the past, I mean, I think our ancestors are already comfortable with this uncertainties. And the more that we want to exercise this to control the future, for example, the more likely that there will be unintentional consequences. And second thing is that I think we have to also graduate from that blaming, naming and shaming and blaming who actually did it. The fact that I, for example, show the statistics on CO2 emissions, this is more than blaming. It's just actually stating a fact. And to also encourage those who are more responsible, not to just take the blame, but to understand the reasons why developing economies, for example, are incapable of addressing or being involved in this or implementing these policies that are being negotiated up there. And exactly, like because there's a danger there that you actually imply, the danger of assigning responsibilities, say to indigenous communities, or assigning responsibilities to those who are less capable to implement these policies, for example. And I am very wary of this. I know that by recognizing the agency of the indigenous ontologies, that is important, but I am wary of assigning responsibilities to them. It's not them who need to provide the solutions, but what my position here is to incorporate their perspectives, or at least understand how the consequences of these policies will impact them. Not necessarily the indigenous communities, for example, to be the policy makers, but to be part of that conversation when we design these policies. And finally, issue of empowerment, emancipation of the marginalized, of the silenced, I think plays a very important role when we think about these issues. Thank you, Romel, for that question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Romel Kuraming, for your question, and of course, Dr. Dahlia, for your answer to that question. I understand that you have touched upon what in your response, it's more or less the same response as the one given, a question given at the chat box by Legaspi Ravas, which says here, given the urgency of the impact of the Anthropocene, what would be the most effective counter-universal measure on this effort to universalize the Anthropocene? So more or less, you have actually addressed that in your answer. I remember, Sir, somebody earlier I called out, but I don't know if he was disconnected. It turns out, there, Emmanuel Kaliwan, you now have the virtual floor for your question, Please proceed.
Okay. Good morning. So my question is on technically a theoretical question from a sociological approach coming from Ulrich Beck. So basically, Anthropocene is very much related to the concept of risk society and how modern and moderning society approach the concept of risk in their day-to-day activity. So my question pretty much, is Anthropocene embedded in the concept of risk society, or there are two different concepts that can be taken differently? That's basically my question. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Dahlia?
Right. Thank you for that question, Emmanuel. And I also just want to quickly respond also to Legazpi Rava's question, just to add to that. I think, again, the Anthropocene as a universal term will not be solved by, again, another universalizing response. I think that's what I want to emphasize. But one of the keys to an effective problem solving in this age of the Anthropocene is a nuanced sensibility of the past and present inequalities and hierarchies within the Anthropos. So that's what I want to emphasize. And by doing that, we need a critical lens on the history of human relations with the environment. I think that will more likely prompt effective responses instead of universalizing responses. So we have to really contextualize these responses to the challenges from the Anthropocene and really prevent unintentional duplication of the same practices that led to this epoch. Of course, now we are subjected to the possibility of extinction. So I think that's something, yeah, thank you, Legazpi. I think that's something that we have to be cautious about. So about the question, yes, Ulrich Beck's risk society, the concept of risk society, actually you can find it in many also articles about the Anthropocene, that these scholars who are writing this are actually engaging with this concept of risk society. But at least for me, it's quite informative when I think about the need for reflexivity in the Anthropocene, because that idea of risk society encourages us to be reflexive. So this kind of reflexivity proves, I think, necessary in this era of manufactured global risks produced by the processes of modernization, technological advancements, and resource extraction that Ulrich Beck was wrote about. And he also said that this possibility of a creative self-destruction, right, as an industrial society, there's a need to constantly process the monitoring and reorganization and reforms of these possibilities. And these reforms could be found from individual values, personal values, to social institutions. And I think our ability to be able to incorporate these individual values and the social institutions, this is a reflection of our ability to be reflexive in this Anthropocene. And yeah, because Ulrich Beck warns about this, the sources of danger are no longer about ignorance, but knowledge. That's why I really like what Attorney Capistrano said a while ago about learning and unlearning. And it's not, we have to go beyond this perfect mastery over nature. And again, this informs the human grasp beyond what is available to us as norms, and to understand and recognize the objective constraints that we are experiencing. So definitely risk society is in the Anthropocene, and the conversations about the Anthropocene is very much informed by this. And there is an ongoing conversation between scholars that are articulating risk society and the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much for the question and also for the response. There is a set of questions from Ryan Dave Ryla at the chat box, so allow me to read. My key takeaway from the keynote speech is the centrality of power in the discussions on the Anthropocene. How can stakeholders move towards a general consensus of diverse approaches to responses against growing human security threats? And there is a follow-up. How can we maintain the integrity of discourses on the Anthropocene against co-optation by powerful corporate and state interests?
Right. I think I might need some time to think about the response for this one. But thank you. Excellent question, Ryan.
Okay. We will probably have the answer in a while. I understand that there is a comment from Marlui. Marlui, you want to say something?
Yes, good morning again, Dr. Dahlia. Maybe you've heard of this guy from YouTube. His name is Mr. Beast. He's been inspiring people to donate for certain causes. He was especially famous for hashtag Team Seas, and just recently, Team Seas, Team Trees, and right now he's famous right now for his initiative on cleaning up beaches, hashtag Team Seas. So he has Team Trees and Team Seas. In this case, instead of planting 20 million trees, he's decided that every dollar goes to cleaning up a pound of trash. Well, what are your thoughts on his initiatives, especially given how influential he has been to YouTubers and to people's, I guess, awareness of climate issues?
Dr. Dahlia?
Yes. Thank you, Marlui, for that question. I am not familiar with the YouTuber. But yes, let me get back to that question and answer first Ryan's question. I think the Anthropocene can be either a muzzle or a whistle. So it's really up to us on how to use this. I think, for example, this conference is a whistle, right? Maybe even a megaphone, because we are really engaging with this concept. And despite these challenging times, we are able to confer here virtually. And I think by doing that, we are already deconstructing and disrupting these universals. And how I understand how we approach the Anthropocene, at least within our discipline, or maybe traditionally speaking, conventionally how we do IR, is that it addresses environmental issues because it aims to prevent an environmental backlash against human and state security and human survival. And it's doing that because for the sake of protecting our security and our survival, but not because we are the earth. So I think this myopic view is something that we need to disrupt. And how power informs this myopic view. Power informs how we intellectualize IR. Power informs the international system. And once we recognize how myopic this power is, I think that's the first step in diverging our approaches, pluralizing our approaches. And by the way, I think human security, for example, still will be very relevant and might be as equally relevant or even more relevant or more important than state security, for example, within the discipline. So I don't know all the solutions, but I think these baby steps that we're taking, one concept at a time, one deliberation or one discussion at a time, can contribute to unpacking these universals, disrupting them, and pluralizing them. Thank you. I hope I answered that question, Ryan. And for Marlui, yeah, individual actions are are good. And I think individual actions also somehow eases our climate anxiety. Now there's this climate anxiety. We feel like we need to do something. We think of our future, our children and grandchildren. So to kind of ease that anxiety, we do this individual actions, and I really commend that. And I think it's really important. But at the end of the day, if we really want to dramatically change business as usual practices, it has to be done by those who are the large emitters, for example, by corporations. It's really about policies. Of course, actions outside those policies will contribute a little bit. But if we talk about a geological scale, it has to be a massive top-down policy approaches that will change how multinational corporations, that will change how countries, that will change how these rich individuals live in this age, and this despite this environmental challenges. I would love to see that YouTube channel if you would like to share it with me. Thank you, Marlouie.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm sure Marlouie will be giving you the link soon. Marlouie, yes, you wanted to say something else, Marlouie?
Yeah, actually, just to mention, I think I didn't bring it up, but it wasn't just an initiative by him, this current one, Team C's, because as far as I know, he's actually collaborated with many big YouTubers. Now, of course, I understand that policies do matter, and of course, they're very important. But I feel that in particular, the soft power that these YouTubers have, not to mention their resources, they actually gather millions of dollars for these initiatives. So his goal was 30 million to clean up 30 million pounds. That's $1 per pound. So that's his goal. So while of course, yeah, these may seem like small scale because we have trillions of garbage in the ocean, I believe. So it's a long way to go. But I think the provocation is there that, okay, this guy I like, the one who's been giving a lot of money to people, in his challenges, let's give it. It's very proactive for me, and yeah, and it's an appreciation at least for people like me who are into social media. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dahlia. There is a question from Farland Valera here. The statement goes, "Excellent keynote, ma'am. Then I'm curious about the Ainu in Hokkaido. How have they dealt with issues relating to the Anthropocene in the context of Japanese governance and industrialization?" Salamat, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for that question by Farland. I have to excuse myself from answering this question because I'm not familiar with the policies related to the Ainu people.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to put together two questions that actually followed this from Legazpi Ravas and also from Eric Calata. Legazpi Ravas is asking, our mastery over nature, even our biological nature, has brought us at the brink of our very survival. How can IR and allied social sciences engage to unlearn and relearn to ensure the survival of this planet and the human species? I believe this is quite related to an upcoming panel on revisiting the disciplines. So I believe this might be fleshed out later on, but of course you may have a preliminary answer to this. And in the case of Eric, and I would like to pipe in a related answer, also a query to this one. In a world, so this is from Eric Calata, in a world where capitalism and imperialism not only dominate the course of global environment, but also culture, politics, and the like, what specific political action? So he's looking for a specific political action that you can recommend to people of post-colonial societies to mitigate or eradicate the effects of the Anthropocene. Now, the one that I would like to infuse into these questions would be, you were talking earlier about the anti-intellectualism, the possible anti-intellectualism, and of course, a problem of dismissive epistemologies. And that, yeah, probably one of the calls of the hour is really epistemic disobedience. But in so doing, in highlighting, in making audible and visible the plurality of possible solutions from other bodies of knowledge, how do we assure that we in the global south, particularly those who would like to mediate, for instance, those who would like to facilitate the conversations, would not in turn fall prey to the dangers and risks of silencing those who we believe to be others, or those who we believe to be far too controversial? How do we strike that balance? Dr. Dahlia, that's a load of questions, I know, but I'm sure that you're able to see that it's really how thirsty we are to know how we can get things to motion and start the action, but that we also do not know how urgent it is. But if you say it's too urgent, there might be an element of imposing, of compellence, instead of making the pluralities really come out and shine and be able to showcase what they have to offer for the good of the Anthropocene. Dr. Dahlia?
Thank you, Attorney Capistrano. Another set of excellent questions. I'm not sure if I can quench the thirst for this need for immediate solutions. I know I have mentioned several times the urgency to do something. In fact, whenever I write something about the Anthropocene, and within my writing, I would say that how urgent we need to address this, that we need to be really inclusive, and yet I'm still, publishing in this Western-dominated processes in academia. So there's really this dissonance that I've mentioned during my presentation, and I also feel I feel that I'm also participating or maybe reinforcing this exclusionary practices. But at the same time, as I've mentioned, baby steps, I think just having this conference, I remember when I first had my first presentation about the Anthropocene in 2018 in Taiwan. Patrick was there at the National Changsha University when I presented my first paper on the Anthropocene, and I felt really, I felt like I am not in conversation with other scholars. I know that there's scholars in Australia or in the UK writing about the Anthropocene, but I was really desperate for someone like me, who looked like me, to have a conversation about this. And I think, this conference, when I saw the theme for this conference, I felt really, first of all, of course, I felt very happy, and I felt relieved that yes, now we are having these conversations. I know when we present our paper and publish it later, it will take a long, long time for the review process. But I think despite that lengthy process, and despite the need for agency, if we put it into the scale of, the geological scale, this will still have impact on how we think about the solutions and the challenges in the Anthropocene. The 2030 SDG will be several years, and I hope that we can also contribute to the conversations about that. And this relates to what Legazpi asked about how can IR and allied social sciences engage to unlearn and relearn. And I want to highlight here the need for transdisciplinarity. We tend to work in silos, academic silos, but the Anthropocene, whenever I, for example, read a work about the Anthropocene, I'm always impressed by how extensive, say, the citation is coming from, natural sciences, even coming from the policy sector, the practitioners, and this transdisciplinarity of not just connecting the disciplines, but coming together as one, and also being and contextualizing that coming together within the practitioners, the policymakers, with the society itself. I think that's the first barrier that we can overcome if we embrace this transdisciplinarity and have conversation with our colleagues, not just from our discipline, but also in other disciplines and also outside academia, most importantly. Thank you.
Thank you. There is another comment from Romel Coraming. I wonder if localizing responses to Anthropocenic challenges be merely palliative and worse, would reinforce the complacency of the most powerful groups that have the most resources and capability to address this problem, but do not like.
Yes, thank you again, Romel, for that question. Definitely, there's a danger of when we localize responses, we also instrumentalize and objectify, right, the agency of the local communities. And this is, again, raises the danger of passing on the burden to the local and indigenous community to address these challenges. No, we're not, this should not be the way to go on. The way should not be about passing the burden to them. But again, I think this is also related to what I mentioned a while ago, but to actively, proactively incorporate the impact of those policies on those populations. I mean, it's good if they can be part of the conversations on the table, but I don't think that is necessary. Of course, that's important, but we know already, I mean, as scholars, as scientists, the impact of this, say, solutions on local communities, but to incorporate those in how we design our policies, I think is, yeah, a way to go about this. And I also understand that this, I mentioned about the carbon leakage and how the complacency of these powerful groups actually, instead of addressing the solutions, maybe reinforcing the problems or multiplying the problems. So by calling them out, I think is also one way of doing this. And the publications that I have cited earlier really call out how behind this vilifying characterization of, say, developing economies not contributing, say, to mitigation, behind those, we can see that, for example, countries that are ranking way up high in the sustainability indices or climate mitigation indices, if you look behind those numbers or behind those indices, there's still this unequal or imbalance relationship between the powerful and the less powerful, the wealthier and the less and the poorer countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a lengthy statement here. Allow me to read from Dominic Jan Ramos. Currently, the UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, United Kingdom, is currently ongoing. This conference aims to get the commitment of countries to decrease their usage of fossil fuels and increase in usage of renewable energy. They're also discussing how developed countries should compensate the developing countries for their greater contribution to the effects of climate change and global warming. However, despite the big talks, it seems that bold actions are missing. Meanwhile, the Philippine government delegation until now refuses to have talks with CSO Philippine delegations, so who are also there attending COP26 on observer status. Any bright ideas on how can CSO Philippine delegation can get the Philippine government delegation to sit down and listen to their proposals on how the Philippines will be able to adapt renewable sources of energy?
Yeah, I completely agree with this observation. There's so much disappointment about the non-representativeness of the delegation. I don't know exactly how we can ensure that the Philippine delegation will be more inclusive in future talks about the climate. But I think the leadership has to be changed as well. unfortunately, right? Unfortunately, no matter how much we discourse here, if there's no change in leadership that is really willing to be inclusive of our suggestions, then nothing will happen. The election is coming up, so I think there's also an opportunity for us to put into power or to ensure that our future leadership will recognize the shortcomings that we have done when it comes to this climate talks and be more inclusive and representative of the broader Philippine population when we sit down on the negotiating tables at the international level and talk about climate change.
Thank you very much. There is another question here. So this is on major decision makers from global problems, offshoring of lower costs than nearshoring during the pandemic. So the question is there a perspective that would allow global governance to internalize costs of global problems that would incentivize them to act to resolve these problems? Pertinent to this, Dr. Dahlia, because I just came from, just last week, we had an extramural, international extramural on decolonial perspectives, and it's about asserting the rights of people from the global south. And there is such a thing as colonialism reparation, for instance. So do you see, because in the case of decoloniality, there are now serious talks among decolonial scholars all over the globe, particularly from the global south, and they're doing and holding regular conversations. I would like to ask you, do you see that there is already this momentum, that the time is right, for example, for intellectuals, people in the academe, transdisciplinarity, coming up with a more programmatic action, sustained conversations, and ensuring that there is such a thing as reparation, for instance, Anthropocene related? Dr. Dahlia?
Thank you for that, Billy, and thank you, Attorney Capistrano. Yes, I think we need to demand more strongly and more urgently this reparations. But at the same time, it shouldn't stop us. We should not be waiting for reparations to act. It can go hand in hand. While waiting for reparations, we also do our part when it comes to addressing these challenges. And again, this is where the danger of having a black and white approach and a less nuanced approach to this issues is that yes, we need reparations, and yes, we actually we deserve reparations, but at the same time, for the capabilities, no matter how limited they are right now, for the capabilities that we have, we can still exercise our agency, right? The lack of reparation doesn't silence our agency to act, to contribute to the solutions in the challenges in the Anthropocene. And I also want to mention about this, the state-to-state interaction that Billy mentioned, and if there are solutions. Yes, I've mentioned in my presentation this problematic, the problematic foundations of how states interact with each other, the problematic foundations of the international system, the world order that is very state-centric and militaristic and capital-driven. And yes, I have thought about this. For example, about, say, in contrast to militaristic, dominantly militaristic responses, I think it will also be effective, but it's not too drastic to the point that, say, those who profit from militarism will not do it. But something in between, for example, is to allocate a percentage of military spending to social and environmental protection. This is one of the solutions, I think, and it's a little bit gradual move from militarism toward environmentalism that I think will give governments enough sufficient time to adapt to this changing geopolitics, right? And for this capital-driven international system, we also have seen now efforts, say, to provide alternatives to this capital accumulation and economic growth-driven development, at least within the region, within the Asia-Pacific region. You might have heard about the circular economy. It's still, of course, it's still, there's many criticisms about it, but in general, I think adopting that circular economy, although it's an alternative to this capital-driven economy, it still provides that, again, gradual move from what we are so used to do towards something that not as drastic, but equally effective, I think. And China, for example, is very much adopting the circular economy and also supporting a lot of initiatives in other countries that try to adopt, not wholly, but at least some aspects of the circular economy. Yeah, so those are, again, I'm not sure how effective this would be. There's several studies about this, but this is, again, a step of, if we really want to exercise our agency, and an agency that is informed by our unique histories, it's better than just doing nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Dahlia Simangan, our keynote speaker for this FISO 2021 conference, international conference, the Global Anthropocene. Indeed, it is important for us to really know the magnitude of the problem that we face that you mentioned earlier. We are just really a hairline difference between survival and demise, and that we have to make sure that whatever problems we are facing and solutions we want to have, we make sure that they match, not mismatch. I'm incidentally reminded of one of my major research interests that more or less informs me, which is about Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's concept of liquid modernity, and that we are living in very liquid times. We have fluid problems, and that if we continue to get stuck presenting and coming up with solid solutions to liquid problems, then we are not solving them at all. So thank you so much for a very enlightening talk. It's very empowering, and it was definitely cerebral and intellectual. Thank you for this experience, Dr. Dahlia. And I now turn over. I also thank, of course, those of us who have asked questions for engaging with us in this important conversation. And I now turn you over to our host, our MC, Marlouis. Marlouis, thank you.
Thank you as well, Attorney Archil. So, yes, also thank you to our speaker, Dr. Dahlia, for answering so many insightful questions and indulging in some of our, our inquiries. And also to everyone asking questions, thank you so much. And we hope to gain more insights from this as well. So now, because we are about to end this morning's event, we would like to present to you our heartfelt appreciation in the form of a certificate of appreciation. So allow me to read the citation here. This certificate is hereby presented to Dahlia Simangan, PhD, in grateful appreciation for her valuable support and expertise rendered as keynote speaker on the topic Disrupting the Universality of the Anthropocene during the conduct of Global Anthropocene Free Virtual International Conference, held on this day, November 6, 2021, via Zoom platform. Signed by the President of the Philippine International Studies Organization, Frances Antoinette Cruz, and the conference chair, Kebart Dikayan. So congratulations, Dr. Dahlia. And to remind our audience now, where we are right now is Zoom room number 1. So you can come back here for the upcoming panels that will be held in the afternoon. Alternatively, if you're interested in other topics, you may proceed to Zoom room number 2. So please remember the links here as well as the password. And we hope to see you after lunchtime. So I hope everyone has a sumptuous lunch And thank you so much for participating. Oh yes, here are the Zoom room respective table panels and topics, including the book launch and the roundtable discussion. So yes, again, we look forward to seeing everyone again at 1:30. To remind presenters, please be here at 12:30 so that we can prepare ahead of time. And to everyone, have a pleasant day ahead of you.